The MEA, Municipal Class EA, or MCEA, recognizes the desirability of coordinating the planning processes and approvals under the EA Act and the Planning Act as long as the requirements of both acts are met. This module is intended to provide an overview of the integration provisions, Section A.2.9 of the MCEA that enable requirements under the MCEA to be coordinated with applications made under the Planning Act, and to facilitate and encourage the use of the integrated land use planning and MCEA process where appropriate. The outline of this integration training module consists of the following sections: overview, who can use the integrated approach, project boundaries, notification, documentation, amendments, monitoring, and frequently asked questions. Under the Environmental Assessment Act, all municipal activities are subject unless otherwise exempted. Projects are subject to either an individual EA or a self-assessment process. Examples of the self-assessment process include the Municipal Class EA, the Transit Projects Regulation, and Waste Management Projects Regulation. Individual EAs are used for complex projects that have the potential for significant environmental effects, for example, large landfills. A Class EA, for example the Municipal Class EA, is used when the impacts are known, predictable, and can be mitigated, for example, an expansion to a wastewater treatment facility. What is a Class Environmental Assessment? A Class Environmental Assessment is a self-assessment planning process that allows proponents to follow an approved planning process for projects that are generally recurring, have a predictable range of environmental effects, and are responsive to mitigation. The MCEA has been subject to review and approval under the EAA, which determined, in part, that the application of the MCEA process would enable proponents to meet the intent and purpose of the EAA for a specific group of projects. The MCEA provides a reasonable mechanism for proponents to fulfill their responsibilities to the public in an efficient, timely, economic, and environmentally responsible manner. The nature of the project determines the level of assessment. The assessment is proponent-led. Projects identified in an MCEA are approved and conditional upon being planned according to the requirements set out in the MCEA, not being made subject to a higher order of EA. Part 2 order provisions allow the minister to require an individual EA if significant environmental issues or concerns warrant. The integrated approach still involves the completion of the procedural requirements of this Class EA based on whether the project is classified as a Schedule B or Schedule C project. If the project is defined as a Schedule B project, the proponent must complete Phase 1 and 2 of this Class EA. If the project is categorized as a Schedule C project, the proponent is required to complete Phases 1 through 4 of this Class EA. All Class EA planning principles and mandatory consultation and documentation requirements still apply. Municipalities and EA practitioners recognize the desirability of integrating the planning processes and approvals under the MCEA and the Planning Act, as long as the intent and requirements of both acts are met. By completing the requirements for environmental assessment and land use planning processes at the same time, proponents can streamline their efforts and more effectively meet the requirements of both the Planning Act and the MCEA. Another benefit is reducing duplication, leading to faster implementation. When carrying out an integrated approach, the requirements of the Planning Act and the MCEA must still be met. Integration does not provide an exemption from MCEA requirements. The types of Planning Act applications or documents that may be integrated with the MCEA using the integration approach include an official plan amendment including secondary plans adopted as an official plan amendment, community improvement plan, plan of subdivision, and a plan of condominium. Applications may be initiated by the municipality or by a private sector developer or both as co-proponents. For a project that is subject to this Class EA and which is one of the types of Planning Act documents identified in Section 8.2.9 of this Class EA and which has taken effect under the Planning Act, and the proponent has fulfilled the requirements of this Class EA as outlined in this section, then the proponent may proceed to implement the project. It is the responsibility of the proponent to ensure that they have fulfilled all of the Planning Act and EA Act requirements for their project, as well as obtaining any other necessary approvals or permits. In many cases, it is beneficial to begin the planning process by considering a group of related projects or an overall system or a number of integrated systems prior to dealing with project-specific issues. By planning in this way, the need and justification for individual projects and the associated broader context are better defined. Long-range infrastructure planning enables the proponent to comprehensively identify need and justification and establishes a broader context. Within the broad context, a range of infrastructure options can be established and evaluated. The combined impact of alternatives is also better understood, which may lead to better and other solutions. In addition, the opportunity to integrate with land use planning enables the proponent to look at the full impact of decisions from a variety of perspectives, as well as streamline the approvals process. Why should an integrated approach be used? Although the requirements of both acts must still be met, there are opportunities to make two processes more efficient. There are opportunities to combine the public and government agency consultation, documentation including technical and supporting studies, land use planning, and infrastructure requirements. Using a coordinated planning approach can be faster than considering requirements and obtaining approvals in a sequential manner, and it can improve planning and land use decision-making processes for municipalities and private sector proponents. Using the integration provisions under the MCEA is voluntary. A proponent is not required to follow an integrated approach if a project has requirements under both the MCEA and the Planning Act. Considerations need to be made by the proponent regarding the project schedule, timing of the Planning Act applications, completion of studies, public and stakeholder interest, and implementation target dates, amongst other factors. It is possible to terminate an integrated approach once the process has been initiated, if during the course of the project, consideration suggests that two separate processes may be more effective. Work undertaken prior to this decision does not need to be redone, as it was undertaken with the intent of meeting both acts. However, future work must still meet the requirements of this Class EA and the Planning Act approvals process being used. If termination of an integrated approach occurs following the announcement or public notification of a project having been given, subsequent notices or independent notices shall be issued advising that an integrated approach is no longer being followed. The Environmental Assessment Act clearly defines proponent, those persons or entities who are subject to the requirements of the Act. The proponent of a project using the integrated approach is the same as the applicant under the Planning Act, whether the proponent is a municipality, a private sector developer, or both. Two or more municipalities and/or private sector developers may act as co-proponents. When using an integrated approach, the proponent is the same as the applicant under the Planning Act. Ontario Regulation 345/93, made under the EA Act, designates private sector developers as subject to the requirements of the EA Act if a private sector developer is proposing an undertaking of a type listed in Schedule C and the undertaking involves the provision of roads, water, or wastewater facilities for the residents of a municipality. The requirements of the integrated approach are the same for municipalities and private sector proponents. Regulation 334 enables all municipalities to make use of the MCEA process to fulfill EA Act requirements. Public sector proponents include municipalities, Public Utilities Commission, and the Ontario Clean Water Agency. Municipalities should not avoid their EA Act requirements through the use of conditions on a Planning Act approval where the appropriate proponent for the work is the municipality. Municipal proponents should consider long-range planning decisions and proponency before approving development proposals. A number of municipalities and/or private sector developers may jointly undertake a project for their mutual benefit as co-proponents. Class EA requirements and schedules for an integrated project where there is more than one proponent shall be those of the municipality, and the higher schedule applies. For example, there may be situations where co-proponents of a project may be considering a Schedule B activity. If the co-proponency involves a private sector developer, the MCEA requirements are those of the municipality and not the private sector developer. Proponents may also change during the planning and implementation of a project. It may be necessary for a change in the proponent of the project to be made, particularly if the MCEA process is carried out over a long period of time or if a master planning approach is used to consider the long-term need for the future infrastructure. Initial Class EA phases may be completed by one proponent, and following phases may be completed by another. For example, a municipality may use a master plan to complete phases 1 and 2 of this Class EA process, while a private sector proponent, building upon the work completed by the municipality, completes phases 3 and 4 of this Class EA process through the standard Class EA process or through the use of the integrated approach. If a proponent is relying on work completed by another proponent to fulfill their requirements under this Class EA, the proponent needs to ensure that the work that is being relied upon meets the requirements of Section A.2.9 and that they are able to make use of the work completed by the other proponent. There may be restrictions on the use of previous work by others, example, reliance or copyright. Projects being planned using the integrated approach can include the infrastructure that is located on lands beyond the boundaries of the lands that are the subject of the specific Planning Act application, provided that the need for the infrastructure is triggered by the project being planned. Any infrastructure extending beyond the Planning Act application boundaries must be directly related to and required by the application. If infrastructure beyond the boundaries of the Planning Act application is required, the off-site infrastructure project should involve the municipality as a co-proponent. A municipality that chooses not to act as a co-proponent may still authorize a private sector developer to proceed with the project, subject to their municipality's review and approval. When a project extends beyond the Planning Act application boundaries, the associated investigations and documentation for the integrated approach also needs to extend beyond the Planning Act application boundaries. For example, documentation of existing or baseline conditions and environmental effects would need to be expanded appropriately beyond the Planning Act application boundary to reflect the potential effects of both the on-site and off-site infrastructure. Recognizing that off-site infrastructure is needed may not be possible at the earliest stages of project planning when the need for specific infrastructure may not yet have been determined. The level of information included in the notices should increase as project planning decisions are made. Under the integrated approach, mandatory points of contact and minimum notification requirements remain the same as outlined in sections A.3.4, A.3.5.3, A.3.6, and A.3.7 of this Class EA. Consultation, including notices, is the responsibility of the proponents. Under the Planning Act, municipalities and/or approval authorities are required to issue notices of statutory meetings and notices of decision. If the proponent of the project following the integrated approach is not the municipality and/or the approval authority, the proponent is encouraged to work with the municipality and/or the approval authority to coordinate the notices of public meetings and notices of decision with the corresponding notifications required under the MCEA for both timing and content requirements. Concurrent tasks, such as public meetings, may occur and combined notices could be issued under this Class EA and the Planning Act. The content of combined notices will vary according to the type of Planning Act application and its associated regulatory requirements and the applicable MCEA schedule. Differences between MCEA notices and Planning Act notices may relate to factors such as timing, distribution, content, format, and author. When combining notices to meet the requirements under the MCEA and the Planning Act, the proponent must ensure the requirements of both are met. Combined notices must, at a minimum, include the following: a clear statement that an integrated approach is being used, a clear statement that appeal on the Planning Act application and related infrastructure is to be made to the OMB, a clear statement that a Part 2 order request may be made to the Minister of the Environment if there are unresolved, significant environmental concerns, a description of the project which includes information about the municipal infrastructure to which this Class EA applies and the type of Planning Act approval being sought, and required information that shows that all applicable legislative and regulatory notice requirements under the Planning Act and this Class EA have been met. Documentation and supporting technical reports must be provided to review agencies and key stakeholders for their review and comment as required. Where studies are necessary to support the decisions made, the feasibility of the preferred alternative, and the conclusions drawn about environmental impacts and mitigation measures, these technical studies must be provided to the review agencies at an early stage in the integrated planning process before the 30-day review period. If a proponent is considering whether to use the integrated approach to satisfy their requirements under the Planning Act and this Class EA, proponents are encouraged to notify MOE's regional office, Air Pesticides and Environmental Planning Supervisor, and the Director of Environmental Approvals Branch, and the applicable MMAH Municipal Services Office of their intention. Early notification is encouraged, but it is not mandatory. The Class EA documentation supporting a Planning Act application must be made available to the public and shall include a statement of the purpose, problem, or opportunity, details of the planning process followed, details of the consultation carried out, existing environmental conditions, alternative solutions and evaluation of its potential environmental effects, the preferred solution and its effects on the environment, the mitigation measures to be implemented, and commitments made during the planning process. When preparing documentation for an integrated project that involves a Schedule C activity, the documentation must be clear and traceable. Documentation may be in the form of an environmental study report or an equivalent form, provided that all of the information required as per the MCEA is addressed. Following the issuance of the Notice of Completion, documentation must be provided for a minimum 30-day public review. Depending on the MCEA schedule being followed, interested persons, including Aboriginal communities, regulatory agencies, and the public, must be consulted and feedback obtained during the development and assessment of the proposed project. This stage of consultation is not part of the 30-day public review and should occur during the integrated process. Public review periods may differ for Planning Act and MCEA processes. For example, where an official plan amendment is being sought, the Planning Act requires that a copy of the application and related information and material be made available for public inspection at least 20 days before holding a public meeting. When using the integrated approach and combining notices to meet the requirements under the MCEA and the Planning Act, the proponent must ensure the requirements of both are met. Once all necessary Planning Act approvals have been obtained and the integrated planning process as described in Section A.2.9.3 is complete, the proponent may proceed to implement the project. It is the responsibility of the proponent to ensure that they have fulfilled all of the Planning Act and the MCEA requirements for their project and obtained any other necessary approvals or permits prior to implementing the project. It may be necessary to revise a project that has been planned using the integrated approach due to environmental implications of changes to the project or due to a delay in implementation. Changes to a project can be made following the addenda procedures outlined in the MCEA, refer to Section A.4.1.1 and A.4.3. If a proponent planning a project using the integrated approach has fulfilled its requirements under the Planning Act and EA Act, the project will be subject to requirements associated with the Planning Act approval and not the time-lapse provision set out in the MCEA. The Planning Act does not contain an automatic review of an approval or an automatic expiry if a Planning Act approval is not implemented. A municipality may, however, include an approval expiry provision in certain Planning Act approvals. Example, a municipality may identify a deadline for the proponent to fulfill the conditions of a draft plan of subdivision and/or seek reconsideration of matters through its regular planning reviews. As a matter of good practice and to ensure its currency, municipalities and private sector proponents should undertake a review of the documentation prepared in accordance with Section 8.2.9.4 if the infrastructure has not been constructed within 10 years. The municipality may also apply conditions to planning approvals to require review of the documentation prepared in accordance with Section 8.2.9.4 if the infrastructure has not been constructed within 10 years. After proponents have completed a project using the integrated approach, proponents should briefly summarize how a project has met the conditions in Section A.2.9. Summaries of 1 or 2 pages should be submitted for information and tracking purposes to the Director of Environmental Approvals Branch at the MOE, including copies of the mandatory public and review agency notices. Doing so will assist in monitoring the effectiveness and benefits of the integrated approach. The information provided to the Director of Environmental Approvals Branch at the MOE should include a description of the Planning Act application that was integrated with the Class EA process, how the requirements of the Class EA process were fulfilled with respect to the appropriate Phase 1 through Phase 4 requirements, consultation undertaken including copies of notices, and project documentation. Why is there a 30-day review required when Planning Act requires 20 days? When combining notices to meet the requirements under this Class EA and the Planning Act, the proponent must ensure the requirements of both are met. The more rigorous, stringent requirements apply. In order to issue a notice that combines the notice of completion with the final Planning Act notice, a proponent should consider giving notice of the public meeting 30 days in advance of the meeting to correspond with the public review period for the MCEA documentation. Private sector proponents should work with the municipality who will be issuing the notices under the Planning Act. Who can I contact for more information? Guidance on the integrated approach can be sought from MOE, Environmental Approvals Branch / Environmental Approvals Access and Service Integration Branch, MOE Regional Offices, and applicable MMAH Municipal Services Office. How can Class EA Schedule A projects be addressed in an integrated approach? Schedule A and A+ projects are considered pre-approved under the Class EA and may proceed to implementation without following the full Class EA planning process. Schedule A+ projects are required to notify the public prior to project implementation. No integration is required. The following information is provided for proponents not familiar with MCEA requirements. Contact the MOE, Regional Offices, Environmental Approvals Branch, or both, and/or MMAH for guidance about expected requirements regarding the use of the MCEA integration provisions. Identify how the project fits in with existing and future land uses, connects with other existing and future infrastructure facilities and/or services. Identify expected environmental impacts, both positive and negative, and proposed measures to mitigate potential negative impacts. Provide review agencies and the public with an opportunity to comment on a preliminary draft of the ESR before filing a notice of completion. Prepare a proposed project schedule for conducting the integrated approach, identifying how both Planning Act and MCEA requirements are met and the public consultation opportunities. Can a proponent opt in to the integrated approach? A proponent may determine that it is desirable to follow the integrated approach after the MCEA process has already started. In this case, the proponent shall provide notification of the change in the process to the public and stakeholders. Notice of a proponent's intent to change to the use of an integrated approach for a project may not be given if the notices of completion for the infrastructure project has been filed or a decision rendered on the Planning Act application. Can a project being planned using the integrated approach be terminated after the process has been initiated? Proponents may terminate an integrated approach at any time. Work undertaken prior to this decision does not necessarily need to be redone. If termination of an integrated approach occurs following public notification, subsequent notices shall be issued advising the public and other stakeholders that an integrated approach is no longer being followed. What jurisdiction does the OMB have to make decisions on projects that have been planned using the integration approach? The Ontario Municipal Board, or OMB, is the administrative body to which appeals of land use planning decisions, including the supporting infrastructure, can be made. The OMB does not have jurisdiction over EA matters and cannot elevate a project schedule or make determinations as to whether a MCEA has been satisfactorily completed or if requirements under the EAA have been met. If there are significant unresolved environmental concerns about an integrated project, the MOE has taken the position that anyone may request under Section 16 of the EAA that the Minister make an order to elevate a project to Part 2 of the EAA, thereby requiring the preparation of an individual EA. The ability to request a Part 2 order under Section 16 of the EAA is currently referenced in Section A.2.8.1 of the MEA MCEA. A Part 2 order request should not be used to revisit issues that the requester does not agree with and have already been decided through another planning process, such as official plans, growth plans, and infrastructure plans, because a project is not desired in a community, to resolve land use planning issues, including environmental matters that can be dealt with through other appropriate processes, example, an OMB hearing, and to stop or delay or frustrate the planning of an integrated project.